Back to Haftarah study, the continuation, picking up where we left off. We're going to be looking at the Haftarah for this week's Torah portion, Parashat Mikeitz. The week begins already as soon as you reach Mincha on Shabbat. You're reading the next week's Torah portion, so we're already on the parsha that's going to get read this coming Shabbat. Just briefly about what Haftarah is. Haftarah is a selection from the rest of the Tanakh, the prophetic books of the Tanakh. It usually has a connection to the Parsha or some kind of relevance to the occasion. For example, the Haftarah that we read yesterday actually has a special thematic connection to Hanukkah. It talks about a menorah and rededication, things like that. So sometimes it's seasonal and sometimes it's related to the Parsha. It's frequently read in synagogue, but often little paid attention to because lots of times it's read just in Hebrew. And even if you do have the translation can be really opaque. And it's seldom the topic of the drash or any sort of further discussion. So it makes really fertile ground for us to study and learn in a little bit more detail, because there's some really, really good Haftarah portions. In fact, the one we're gonna read today, I would imagine, is probably already familiar to you. You know it probably at least from popular culture, if not from specific study. There are lots of theories about how reading Haftarah got started, but what really matters for our discussion is that somebody picked these to read. Somebody decided that this was the portion that spoke to them and was the one that they wanted to read at this season or in connection with this parsha. We don't necessarily know exactly how that came to be, but that selection was validated by generations of Jews who have read this Haftarah selection over and over and over in connection with Parashat Mikeitz. The selection of verses also sometimes varies in between different Jewish communities. As Stephanie has noted before, sometimes I take a bit of license to not necessarily read the Haftarah of the week, although generally the default, if you're looking to read something in advance, it'll be the Haftarah selection for the coming Shabbat, and usually the Ashkenazi selection. Sometimes the Sephardim choose differently, but sometimes I do pick differently. Basically, I want to keep a balance in between narrative and prophecy to just keep this fun and interesting. So we did prophecy last time. We'll be doing a bit of narrative this week. Overall, the plan is to do a quick review of the Torah portion, go over some background about the book that the Haftarah comes from, building up some familiarity with these over the course of the year, and then dive in and read and see what comes up. We'll be asking some questions that I think are generally useful for analyzing texts like this, which is really across sort of three different time frames. First, at the time that it was written, how did this text speak to the people it was addressed to at the time it was written? We'll talk about who that audience might have been. How is this text spoken to Jewish communities who read it as the Haftarah in between when it was composed and our present day? And also, how does this speak to us now? What are your connections or your findings in the text that are meaningful and speak to you in this moment? Okay, any questions about form or the plan before we jump in? All right, you should know too, you should be feel free to jump in at any time. Just click off that mute button and get my attention. I'm not necessarily gonna be able to see all of the screens at once, so just raising your hand may or may not do it. But if you do unmute, that'll pop you up to the top of my participants list, and I'll know you have something to ask or to share. And please feel free to do so. This gets a lot more interesting with lively discussion. Okay, so Parashat Mikeitz comes from the book of Genesis. We're continuing the story of Joseph. I always sort of like to think of the transition from Vayeshev this past Shabbat into Mikeitz is sort of like at the end of The Empire Strikes Back. The rebellion is at its lowest points, and we're set up for the comeback. So Joseph is at his lowest point at the beginning of this portion. He's in prison. His father Jacob thinks that he's dead, and Joseph is sort of as far away from redemption as he could possibly be, sort of setting the stage for him to come all the way back. So Pharaoh, Joseph's down in Egypt. Pharaoh has two dreams, and Joseph is summoned to interpret them, because you recall he interprets the dreams of his cellmates while he's in prison. Joseph is summoned to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and he predicts that there'll be 7 years of prosperity in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh is really impressed with Joseph's dream interpretation ability and puts him in charge of food collection and distribution, which turns out to be a really good idea because, of course, the prediction does come true. Joseph marries an Egyptian woman, has 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Joseph's brothers eventually come down to Egypt during the famine years to try to buy food. And Joseph, of course, they don't know who he is. They think he's still dead. Joseph accuses them of spying on Egypt, and he holds his brother Simeon hostage while the rest of the brothers return to the land of Canaan to retrieve Benjamin per Joseph's request. Brothers then come back with Benjamin for more food, and Joseph continues to sort of test them, this time falsely accusing Benjamin of stealing and declaring that Benjamin has to remain his slave. We get some really interesting kind of interfamilial, brothers dynamic here, and a really sweet, I think, touching moment when Joseph finally reveals his true identity to his brothers, who, last they saw him, had thrown him in a pit and then sold him into slavery. So, hi, Adam. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. We're just getting warmed up, getting a review of the Parsha and Parashat Mikeitz. So the Haftarah reading that accompanies Mikeitz comes from the first book of Kings, 1 Kings, chapter 3, verse 15, and it continues until the very first verse of chapter 4. So if you're going to be following along in your own text, you're going to want to open to chapter 3, verse 15 of the book of Kings. I'm going to put the text up on your screens in just a moment, but first I want to give you a little bit of background on exactly what the book of Kings is. I can't remember who's been part of what, but we've read Haftarah out of Kings before, so some of this may be familiar to some of you. Basically, there are 2 books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, in the Hebrew Bible. They were originally 1 book together. The split apart, we're not totally sure when it happened, but it's, I think, just to make sort of indexing easier. And the books of Kings together relate a history of Israel from the declining days of King David, so in about the 10th century BCE, through the beginning of the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile, the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. So about 4 centuries-ish, maybe 4.5 centuries worth of history of Israel. David, you recall, not the first king of Israel. That would have been Saul. David is the first, more divinely approved, I think, king after Saul. And the first book of Kings begins with David in sort of mental and cognitive decline. The rest of the story traces the united monarchy under the end of King David's rule and then under Solomon. There's a split at some point into 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. And the story continues, sort of providing these synchronistic overlapping histories of the 2 kingdoms, north and south, till the northern kingdom is eventually destroyed by the Assyrians, and the remainder covers all the way down until the Babylonian exile in 586. I've called the Book of Kings a history, although that's kind of a strong word by our standards. It's not a history in the contemporary sense, and meaning like a factual description of past events, explanation for their occurrence, that kind of thing. It's really an extended theological essay that's written by a person or possibly persons who had passionately held beliefs, were convinced that the destruction of the northern kingdom and the eventual fall of the southern kingdom as well were due primarily to the misguided policies of their kings. The focus is really on the kings, on the monarchs and their behavior, both their policy decisions in terms of how they ran religious affairs, what sort of foreign worship they permitted or encouraged, but also their personal ethical behavior as well. And the authors describe events selectively. They're not really trying to tell the whole complete impartial story here. They select events that they think are illustrative in some way and support the point that they're trying to make, support their agenda. And they definitely engage in commentary, sort of summarizing these events as illustrations of whatever lesson it is they think is being taught. The whole thing, the 2 books of Kings together, in terms of who would have been reading them at the time they were composed, who they would have been targeted at, would have been relevant reading for the post-destruction communities in both in Judah, the remaining southern kingdom. Basically, after the north was destroyed, the southern kingdom would have been reading some of this, some earlier version of this, and probably also in Babylonia, the exiles in Babylon would have been reading this. They would have read it as sort of explaining their situation from a theological perspective, explaining it as the outcome of the religious policies of their kings, but also of the behavior of their own ancestors, sort of trying to find meaning in this disaster. Okay. Questions? What questions you have about the Book of Kings that I can help you understand? Anything outstanding? So you may have countered this before. The history is complex, but actually not going to be too big of a factor today. So if there was the stuff about northern and southern kingdoms is confusing, it won't matter today. We're talking about Solomon back when the kingdom was still united. All right. So a little bit of background for our Haftarah. So our Haftarah is going to begin in chapter 3, verse 15 of the Book of Kings. And the first two chapters cover how Solomon became king of Israel after David. So about the year 970-ish. David is growing weak. Apparently his oldest living son, he had some sons previously who already have died back in the book of Samuel, but apparently his oldest son, Adoniah, basically boasts that he's going to be the next king before David has even made a decision about who the next king will be. There were not apparently at this time any sort of clear rules of succession. It wasn't just automatically always the next oldest male heir or something like that. This was only the second king Israel's ever had. So, and David was not the descendant of the previous king. So it was sort of all up in the air about who the next king would be. Adoniah thinks it's going to be him. Bathsheba, you may remember as the one that David saw bathing on the roof. Her beauty in the moonlight overthrew you. You're right. Bathsheba has a son, Solomon, and she sort of conspires with the prophet Nathan, to basically talk David into making Solomon the king rather than Adoniah. Solomon eventually, David goes along with it. They sort of trick him, but make it seem like his idea. Solomon eventually has Adoniah killed in chapter 2. Things seem like they're fine at first, but then eventually Solomon sort of consolidates power, has Adoniah and some of the other the supporters who kind of initially supported Adoniah as the would-be king. He basically has them killed and consolidates power. And that brings us to chapter 3. Before we pull it up, I'll say a couple sentences more. So the first 15 verses of chapter 3, Solomon, after consolidating his power, basically starts telling the story of his reign. So Solomon turned to establishing basically strategic alliances with other neighboring kingdoms through political marriage. The beginning of chapter 3 says that he married Pharaoh's daughter. Now, from what we know from archaeological records from Egypt, the Pharaoh never married their literal daughter off to foreign kingdoms. So this is probably a little bit of editorializing or not really understanding exactly the relationships in a foreign court. So it's probably like a relative of the royal family or something like that. But Solomon marries an Egyptian royal, basically, bringing the two kingdoms closer together. He ends up building her a separate palace to live in. This actually sort of anticipates some of what we know about Solomon later, big building projects, right? He ends up building the temple later on. Also, he gets the problems caused by all the foreign wives that he takes. But anyway, he marries an Egyptian royal. He goes to offer sacrifices at a place called Gibeon, which was a large open shrine sort of northwest of Jerusalem. That's fine at this point. I know that sounds like, oh, maybe that's wrong because he's not in Jerusalem. but this is before the temple, so that's sort of viewed from the perspective of the text as still a fine thing to do. He's going to make his sacrifices, and God appears to Solomon in a dream at night. Possible connection to the Parsha already. Take note of that. Our portion has Pharaoh dreaming dreams and Joseph interpreting them. However, this part is not actually in the Haftarah. This is sort of before the Haftarah still. But God appears to Solomon at night in a dream and basically asks Solomon, what do you want me to grant to you? And Solomon asks, could ask for anything, right? But instead asks God to grant him an understanding mind to judge the people and to be able to distinguish between good and bad. God is apparently really happy with this response because Solomon didn't ask for, long life or riches or victory or whatever. God grants him not only his requests for wisdom and discernment, but also all those other things, long life and wisdom and victory. Let me see if did I pull that that portion up? Yes. Okay, so here are the verses immediately preceding our Haftarah. So ours does not start until verse 15. But basically, this is the end of the verses immediately preceding ours, where that records the content of the dream. Solomon saying, "Grant then your servant an understanding mind to judge your people, distinguish between good and bad. For who can judge this vast people of yours?" God is happy about that. Says, you're going to get not only what you asked for, but also all these other things: long life, riches, victory over your enemies, all that kind of stuff. It occurred to me as I was reading this to highlight this line that I've highlighted here. There has never been anyone like you before, nor will anyone like you arise again, because it reminded me of somebody and it reminded me of something and sort of fired a neuron in my mind. And I think we're supposed to be sort of building a picture in our mind already of the kind of person that Solomon is. So let me ask you already, thinking just about the dream part. So far, all we know about Solomon is that he's king and he has this dream. We're given the chance to ask for anything. He chooses to ask for wisdom. What's your sort of, first impression of the guy so far? You can just go ahead and, share. No, you don't have to get called on or anything. First impressions of Solomon so far. What do you think?
Sounds like a great quality in a leader to me.
I would agree. Certainly, periodically lacking from leaders these days. How about Rachel?
Oh, I was going to say basically what she just said. So.
Okay, good. All right. So far, so good, right? This seems like exactly the kind of thing we want. So that line, "There's never been anyone like you before, nor anyone like you again," reminded me of another, wise and beloved leader of Israel. It reminded me of Moses. Source number 2 here, I just pulled the very last 3 verses of the Torah. These are the last 3 verses in the last book of Deuteronomy, which read, "Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, who God had singled out face to face." So it caused me to wonder, is there some sort of Moses comparison going on? Maybe the text is trying to get us to at least, think, when we think of Solomon, also think of Moses. You know what I mean? Trying to build up this picture of Solomon as really, especially wise and especially discerning, almost unparalleled through Israelite history. Margaret, yeah.
Well, one big difference was that Solomon connived. Anyway, he wanted to be king.
Sure.
He maneuvered things to be king. And
Sure.
Moses kept saying, "Please take somebody else. I can't talk well. I'm not that. You
Right.
don't want me, pick
Right.
somebody else."
Right. Yeah. So clearly they're not actually all that parallel for the most part, right? At least in terms of, that's a great example there. I suspect that we're sort of looking at some of the agenda of the author at work here, though, trying to kind of spin Solomon as sort of being a Moses type of a sort of like an archetype or something like that. Someone so wise and so great that He's like a sort of a once in a generation, something like that. Because yeah, you're right. He sort of gets a checkered history, or a little bit later on. But this is right at the beginning of his career. I think we're like we're supposed to be getting first impressions of the guy.
If I could just
Please,
say
yeah, go ahead,
one
Rachel.
thing
Yeah.
came to me.
Mhm.
There are all kinds of virtues one could want in a ruler, and it's interesting to me that the one that this is choosing to highlight is justice, because you could have had a whole long laundry list of things you would want your king to do or be good at. And
Good.
so justice is very important to the audience, the writer, both the Jewish tradition,
Yeah, absolutely. I would say keep that in mind when we start talking about, maybe how this text spoke to Jews in different eras. But you're absolutely right, and I don't think that's a coincidence that this is the opening here, right? About him asking for wisdom, but receiving that and more. Because what follows is actually a series of narratives where all these prophecies come true. First, examples of Solomon's wisdom, but also examples of his victory over enemies, his vast wealth, and eventually also his long life. Like, I think actually those are all things you'd want in a king eventually. The wisdom being the most important. So that's what we lead with. But this is sort of setting up all these narratives, right, to sort of be prophesied and then fulfilled. Okay. So pretty good start for this guy, Solomon, I would say. And, despite what becomes of him later on, I think he's going to come out looking pretty good throughout all this. Okay. So let's turn ahead into the beginning of our actual Haftarah. So the Haftarah begins here, source number 3 in verse 15. And this is pretty short. So you're going to have some pretty short bits to read, but I'm going to invite people, if they would, to do some reading out loud. Let's see. Stephanie, you're at the top of my screen. Would you mind reading just that verse 15 out loud for us?
Then Solomon awoke. It was a dream. He went to Jerusalem, stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented offerings of well-being. And he made a banquet for all his courtiers.
Okay. Thank you. So, like I said, this is the beginning of the Haftarah. So when you open your Chumash in synagogue, this is the first sentence you read. Now, I explained to you all about the dream and everything that came before it. What kind of opening is this? Why leave the content of Solomon's dream out of the Haftarah? Don't answer that yet. I have some theories. I think what we're going to want to do is read the Haftarah, read the story, but then let's circle back to this question about why is the content of the dream left out. I have a theory. I'm curious what you think too, but it's sort of an odd place to start. I mean, it sort of makes the connection to the portion. Okay, dreams in Mikeitz, dreams in Kings, but otherwise, what is this talking about? We have no idea unless we already know the context that it comes from. Beyond that, it looks like he's doing the right thing. He's going to Jerusalem, which we know is a favorite place, not only for God, but from the perspective of the people writing this. He makes sacrifices just like he's supposed to. Seems like he's sort of an upstanding guy so far. Yeah, like he's asked for wisdom. He's pious. So far, so good, right? Cool. Let's keep reading. How about one of the trio there? Maybe Emmett, since your name is listed first. Emmett, do you mind reading source number 4? Are you close enough to your screen?
Yes.
Yeah, go for it. All right, thanks.
Later, 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The first woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. On the 3rd day after I was delivered, this woman also gave birth to a child. We were alone. There was no one else with us in the house, just the 2 of us in the house. During the night, this woman's child died because she lay on it. She arose in the night and took my son from my side while your maidservant was asleep, and laid him in her bosom. And she laid her dead son in my bosom. When I arose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was, dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, it was not the son I had born."
All right, thank you. Who anticipates where the story is going? Who recognizes the story already? Anybody? Rachel does. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right. All right. Some people might see it coming. That's okay. Okay.
Well, I recognize it because my father used to tell us this story when we were
Oh,
kids.
okay. All right. All right. No spoilers yet. Don't give it. Don't
No
give anything
spoilers.
away. Okay. No spoilers. Let them experience it for themselves. Okay. So this, like I said, is the first. This is the first in a block of narratives that demonstrate how God's promises made to Solomon were fulfilled. And it starts with the story about two prostitutes who come to the king and stand before him. These stories are told with basically like an economy of words. They're always trying to pack as much content, as much detail as possible in using the fewest number of words. So any detail here is important. Just from that first sentence, why does this detail matter? Like it specifies specifically that it was two prostitutes. Why? What's being conveyed about this woman or about the scenario? What do you think? And maybe what's being conveyed about Solomon as well. Lynn, go ahead.
Perhaps they're not very like wealthy, or they don't have a lot of resources.
Okay, good. That's probably, it seems reasonable. Seems reasonable. You know, I think these days we may have a more positive view of sex work than there was in the past, but it's possible there's some sort of, you know, implicit questioning of their moral character or something going on. That's hard to say for sure, but it certainly is a little bit suspect. Let's see. Oh, Lynn, I saw you popped to the top of my screen. Did you have something to share or not?
Oh, I was just going to ask if prostitutes had the same sort of, like you said, moral questionability, and if so, at that time, then it says a lot that they felt that they could come to within the boundaries of established society.
It's a good question, and I think that's a good one for more research. I don't have enough evidence at my fingertips to say for sure, but that's sort of that's kind of the vibe that I get, I guess. So I would say it's possible. Margaret, what do you think?
Well,
Margaret,
it could be to illustrate that he's king of everyone and judge in this case.
Okay.
They're not upper class. They're not influential.
Right.
They're not someone that everyone in the kingdom would know about. They're
Sure.
just people.
Yeah. Excellent. That's sort of something I noticed too, that I think we may be supposed to read, or sort of like imagine this is a stage play, Solomon in his, you know, regal robes and all this kind of stuff, and two very, you know, humble looking women coming before him. Sort of gives the impression of being kind of a man of the people, right? You know, not just judging the high stakes important cases, but even something as seemingly unimportant as this dispute between two commoners, right? Good. Yeah, I think that's maybe something we're supposed to be reading in here. Stephanie.
It also speaks to the kind of palace that he runs, that the guards let people like that in.
Sure, the open door policy, right? But for the king's policy, right? That anyone can come in and be judged. Well, as we'll see, perhaps fairly, or at least have their case heard before in what's effectively the highest court in the land, right? Yeah, good. So I think this is all important stuff to keep in mind as we're kind of building a picture of what this text is trying to teach us, and teach us about Solomon. Just based on the details we have here, and I'm going to encourage you to take off your very pious good Jew hats and put on your critical, you know, kind of academic scholarly hats, and tell me, what are the odds do you think this incident actually happened? Yeah, okay. Margaret or Stephanie? I'm sorry. Stephanie, go ahead. Yeah.
Probably about 5%.
5%, Stephanie says. Adam, what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's possible. You know, it's plausible.
Right. But this seems a little bit too perfect, right? Like a little bit too neat. something like this? Like, what are the factors that make this a really challenging case for Solomon? Because this is good. This seems like a tough case to judge, right? This is what makes this difficult from sort of from the sort of narrative tension standpoint. Why is this a good narrative challenge for Solomon?
Well, it's she said, There's
exactly,
there's,
right?
There's no witnesses.
No witnesses to interview, right? So no way to get any more evidence that way. What else?
I'm wondering if women were regarded as trustworthy witnesses in those days at all, actually.
Ooh, actually, that's a good point too. It didn't even dawn on me that we might be supposed to mistrust these people just because they're women, as grotesque as that is. That is not out of the question that like this would be a different story if it was two, from the perspective of the teller, that if it was two men, right? Like these are, I think, in the storyteller's imagination, maybe about the most unreliable people possible, or something like that, right? Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
But it's so important to them,
right?
Because the son would grow up and take care of them in their old age.
Right. Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. He would probably be their protector, or, the sort of a breadwinner for them. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Not to mention it just like, it tugs at the heartstrings, right? The idea that someone would steal someone else's baby, right? Like, that's tragic. The stakes here are really high. I think also another factor to consider is, oh, sorry, Adam, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, with men would be disputes of property or things like that. This is a whole different category of relationships,
Yeah, and if it was just a straightforward property thing, we might be able to figure it out,
right? With
just like, let's calculate the value here and do some math and figure out who owes people what. But how are you supposed to resolve this? Like, this is a relationship dilemma here. Leah, yeah.
I don't think, I'm going back to your original question about the percentage. Might this story be true?
Okay.
Well, we hear lots and lots of stories where one woman's child dies and she goes and she kidnaps another woman's child. It doesn't necessarily, or prostitutes, it doesn't necessarily be in the same household.
Sure.
This description makes it even more dramatic than it might be, but I don't know that that's an uncommon scenario.
Yeah, I think you're right. It like sort of pushes the like the challenge as far as it can go without losing plausibility. Like, this is definitely still something that could have happened, even if it is sort of a really neat little setup, right? Yeah, that's a good point. I think the other factor here, sort of building on kind of what Adam was getting at, that since it's not a property case, there's no way to establish sort of hard facts. Like, you can't establish maternity just from the physical evidence at hand. Like, they don't have any DNA tests or anything like that. I think we're supposed to assume there's no way to know for sure whose kid this is, except through some sort of deduction, right? Some sort of expression of wisdom on the part of the judge. Okay. Let's keep reading. Let's see. Maybe someone who hasn't gotten to speak up yet. Davis, are you interested in reading at all?
I'll pass, but thank you.
Okay. All right. Maybe one of the maybe who's next in the squad of folks there? Tali or Jade or Emmett? I'm calling you the squad now, I've decided.
Okay. I have a slightly different translation, but I'll read what you have on the screen so it's consistent.
Oh, okay. Good.
The other woman spoke up, "No, the live one is my son, and the dead one is yours." But the first insisted, "No, the dead boy is yours, mine is the live one." And they went on arguing before the king. The king said, "One says, 'This is my son, the live one, and the dead one is yours.' The other says, 'No, the dead boy is yours, mine is the live one.' So the king gave the order, 'Fetch me a sword,' and a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, 'Cut the live child in two, and give half to one and half to the other.'"
Okay, now who recognizes this story? Oh, a few more people? Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. So, again, no unnecessary words, no unnecessary details, but we have this sort of repetition. One woman, the other woman, no, the second, I'm going to refer to them as the first and the other. The other woman, the second one, speaks up and said, no, the live son is mine, dead one is yours. And the first insists, no, the dead one is yours and the live one is mine. And the king repeats it back at him. Says one says this, the other says that, right? What do you make of that? Leah, you've got your hand raised. What would you like to suggest?
No, I didn't actually raise my hand, only to say that I recognize the story.
Oh, sorry. Very good, very good. Well, who wants to take a shot there? What do you think? Why bother having the king repeat out loud what the people just said? Like, we don't need it. We just read it. It can't be for our benefit. What do you think? One of the squad, Emmett, Talia, Jade.
I'm not sure why they went as far as to like repeat everything, but I guess it signifies that like he's listening and he's actually entertaining what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely got to be at least a part of it, right? That's one of the things they. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, but doesn't the Bible do that a lot? Repeat for emphasis to make sure you got it.
That would be the sort of cynical understanding of the repetition, is that it's just repeating for emphasis. The sort of midrashic understanding is that there are no coincidences, and any sort of repetition must be coming to teach us something important. That's kind of our approach in here.
Okay.
The super cynical approach is that some scribe just screwed up and copied the text twice.
No.
Almost certainly happened in a few places.
I really wasn't meaning anything.
No, I know.
Well, I think I was meaning what you said.
Right. Yeah, I know. But I think we're like, from the standpoint of the story, it seems like we could do away with this potentially and not lose any content. So there must be a reason, for the sake of the narrative, that we get it. Leon, what do you think?
Is it maybe because as a judge, as a good judge, he wants to make sure he's understanding the facts and the both sides correctly, and not just kind of out of thin air, or maybe on a biased basis making a judgment?
I think that makes a lot of sense. Adam, is that just what you're going to say?
Well, yeah, that was one of them, and that was a better put than I could. The other thought I had was, this is a little subtler, but when the plaintiffs speak, it sounds, it has a certain obvious tone to it. It's from them. When the voices of the judge, in this case, the reader, us as the reader,
right?
Something clicks in our mind where we perk up in a different way, listening to it. Okay, Solomon has now repeated this, but it's Solomon speaking and not the women.
Sure.
One's not more important than the other, but it shifts perhaps how we're looking at the text a little bit.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, so I think you're probably almost all correct that this is probably on some level a demonstration of Solomon's diligence in gathering evidence, right? That he wants to make sure he's got all the evidence correct before he issues on any kind of ruling or dispenses any judgment. He wants to make sure he's got it right. I have another theory, but I'm going to wait to reveal it till later on. That I think may be sort of along the lines of what Adam's getting at. It's like it's a repetition both for our sake as the readers to kind of absorb the situation, perhaps, and also, to say something about Solomon. Yeah, Stephanie, go ahead.
It gives validation to what they have said.
How do you mean validation by who? How do you mean?
Solomon, by repeating it, gives validation to the case that they've brought before him.
He's sort of saying, it's like he's saying, I believe you.
Yeah.
Or something like that. Like,
all right,
I believe that you're both telling your honest version of the story, or something like that. Like that I'm accepting these statements into the evidence before the court, or something like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Actually, I think that makes sense. That this is sort of telling us, Solomon hears them. He understands. He's got the facts. He's ready to make a decision. Okay. So what he does is immediately order this child, the living child, to be killed, split in half, and distributed half and half, right? I think we can take for granted that he doesn't actually intend to kill the child here, especially if you know where this story is going. But this is supposed to be a dramatic story. This is about demonstrating wisdom. So I think there's got to be something sort of out of left field, unexpected, in order to build up the tension. And if, right at this moment, right where the king is like, get the sword, we're going to cut this child in half. This is like where the tension is, like I'm gripping my seat. I don't want this child to get killed. No, this is not how this is supposed to go, right? Like, this is a really good narrative. This is really good storytelling right now. Okay, let's get some resolution here. How about let's see, who hasn't read yet that would like to? Maybe Margaret, are you ready to read?
But the woman whose son was the live one pleaded with the king, for she was overcome with compassion for her son. Please, my lord, she cried, give her the live child, only don't kill it. The other insisted, it shall be neither yours nor mine, cut it in two. Then the king spoke up. Give the live child to her, he said, and do not put it to death. She is its mother.
Okay. So it doesn't say, like, since these women don't have names, it's hard to say it's hard to know exactly who he means when the king spoke up and says, give the child to her. But I think we're supposed to clearly understand that it's the one who's like, don't kill it, right? Not the other one, the one who says like, okay, fine, kill that child, right? This is our big payoff moment, right? The convincing threat of murdering the living child bothers the real mother enough for her to say, you know what, it's more important that the child be alive than for him to be with me. Whereas the imposter here, doesn't have that kind of emotional connection. It's a little bit more like a property issue, right? And so the truth comes out. One of them, finally we were able to discern the difference between these two women and figure out, in a scenario where there was no material evidence and no corroborating witnesses, who the real mother is. Just out of curiosity, what do we think about this? Do we think this might work in real life? Have we strained the bounds of plausibility too far here, or are we hanging in there? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a broader lesson in that probably one that's used today when there are custody disputes over children is who's going to be the better parent.
Sure. Although, I find it hard to believe that a judge in America these days would use some sort of like...
Oh, you mean the sword thing and all that?
Yeah, the sword thing. That's kind of what I was getting, right?
No. I don't think that would happen today.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure that would have ever happened. I don't know.
Yeah, right. So that's my question is like, have we gone too far here? Is this still plausible in your minds?
It may not be plausible, but it wouldn't have. It's like when you dramatize truth in a movie,
Yeah.
They'll add something on for dramatic purposes that
right.
It's not how it really happened. And
right.
sometimes we kind of know that's not how it really happened, but it kind of grips us and
right.
gets our attention and makes us enjoy it more.
That's kind of where I'm at too, is like, we're right up against the line where this might be a little bit too neat and tidy. It does feel like kind of like a movie scene or something like that. How about Adam? I know you're ready to share something, and then one of Emmett, Tully, or Jade too. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah. I mean, until you read it, of course, I knew the story, but
yeah.
It was being read again. It's like I thought, no. I mean, the woman who wanted to take the child away, they're both, real people with real feelings. I don't think that anyone would have agreed to have the child cut in half.
Right.
In any plausible scenario.
So I think that's it. I think that's it too for me. It's like, if I had to pick one spot where it feels like it goes a little bit too far, it's the woman who says, okay, fine, cut it in two, right? Like, I don't know, really? Like, this is so much of a, just a matter of property to you that you're willing to do this. So I think that's right where it loses me. But up until that point, I think we're hanging in there.
But
Emmett or Talia or Jay, did you guys have something to add to? Yeah,
Can I say something?
yeah, go ahead, please.
So I just kind of felt that it was also like a reflection, even though this maybe wouldn't happen like now. It's kind of out there, but it might be like a reflection of how like the power of like the king in this case, or like the government nowadays would like have like the final say in like what the actual like judge's decision would be.
Yeah.
So like in like some sort of like custody battle, it like just like whether or not like the child like the decision of like where it would go and like its like final outcome is like entirely based upon like what the king would want or the government or whatever. And like this is like a really like dramatized version of like he could even have the power of like allowing it to die.
Yeah. Yeah. No one sort of ever questions whether or not the king has the power to do this, right? You know, what stops him? The response is no, you can't murder this child. No one ever questions that idea. It's just no, please don't, right? Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah. Good. Okay, so I want to point out a couple of things in this section that are kind of lost in translation, some things that are kind of cool about the Hebrew. So the line in verse 26, the woman whose son was alive pleaded with the king, for she was overcome with compassion. The Hebrew words that are translated overcome with compassion are nichmeru rachamecha. So it literally means her guts were churning. Rechem is like a womb or guts. So literally her guts were twisted up. They were churning somehow. And I already suggested that the connection in between this and our portion is the bit about dreams, right? Because it starts with the dream thing. But, and I think this is super cool, that same expression, like that somebody's guts were churning, which clearly means like they were kind of overcome with feeling somehow, appears in only one other place in the whole Hebrew Bible, in our portion. It's used to describe Joseph when he spots Benjamin there with his brothers. So Benjamin and the brothers show up in Joseph's court, and they still don't know who Joseph is, but Joseph is overcome with emotion. You can see the Hebrew right here. Nichmeru rachamav. Literally, his guts were churning, and it translates the same here. Overcome with feeling towards his brother and on the verge of tears. So he went away into another room and cried there. So I actually don't know if this is sort of a strong, like a quote unquote strong enough connection to make that the sort of linchpin of why this is the Haftarah read. Just the fact that there's two uses of this phrase. But that seems like a really cool connection to me, right? That the only other place this is used, and it's like such a descriptive, expression too, that the guts were churning, like the rachamim is a word you might otherwise know. Rachamim is usually translated as compassion. So, the basic meaning though appears to be like guts. And so it's kind of like biblical Hebrew recognizing that compassion is at some level a gut feeling or something like that, right? And and two really emotional scenes where it's deployed. I just think that's a super cool connection that I wanted to point out. And one other piece here that's also sort of lost in translation, when the let's see, it's the oh right, so she's the woman who says, please my lord, give her the live child. The Hebrew we would expect there would be the word yeled, like literally just a child, give the child. But she changes her Hebrew a little bit here. Instead of yeled, she says yalud, which is the sort of passive version of it. So it's a more like literal reading would be, give her the one who was born and don't kill it. Sort of as if to say, or as if implying like, give the one who was born by me or born to me away to her. So I think this may be another way of sort of, sneakily conveying or tacitly conveying that Solomon got it right, and she was the one, because she sort of also betrayed herself with her language, that she was really the mother, the way she talked about this child. Whereas the other one just just sort of says, calls it an it, right? It's a thing, right? It's not like something I have an emotion, human that I have an emotional connection to. I'm not totally certain about that one, but I just noticed that sort of unexpected little bit in the Hebrew that I thought to call attention to. Okay, let's wrap it up. The Haftarah is actually quite short, so let's wrap up our reading, and then I think it'll be kind of fun to ask some questions about the story as a whole. Let's see, we need another reader. How about Leah? Leah, do you mind reading?
Sure.
All right, go ahead, thanks. You get all of 2 verses.
Do 2. Okay. When all Israel heard the decision that the king had rendered, they stood in awe of the king, for they saw that he possessed divine wisdom to execute justice. King Solomon was now king over all Israel.
Okay, so that right there is actually the end of the Haftarah. It ends right there. I showed you what comes next because I sort of want to illustrate a point here, but the Haftarah ends right here, like the part that gets read in the synagogue. So all Israel heard the decision and they stood in awe, right? I think this is where we really reveal the intention or the purpose behind sharing this whole story at all, right? Early in Solomon's career, it's sort of setting Solomon up as, sort of authenticated or justified or deserving, like we're sort of, affirming that he deserves to be the king of Israel, right? And the people recognize it, right? They saw that the divine wisdom is real. That said, Margaret, did you have something to say further on that?
No, I'll bring it up at the end.
Okay. That said, though, so it's great. Like Israel loves it. He's a great judge. That last line, though, is sort of weird. King Solomon was now king over all Israel, and you notice that is the way the chapters and verses are divided up. That's the first verse of the next chapter. So those chapter and verse divisions aren't original to the text of the Book of Kings. They were added later by people who are going back and trying to sort of standardize this for study and reading. So so that later person said, okay, this verse, King Solomon was now king over all Israel, actually goes with what follows. It's part of chapter 4, not part of chapter 3. But the Haftarah chooses to connect it to what came before. So I'm curious, why? What does this last line add? Why bother to read this last line at all? And I have no idea what the answer is, so I'm really curious what you think. Adam, go for it.
Well, let's see. Well, first, does it mean that, so he was now king over all the kingdoms, not, I mean, instead of, they weren't divided. Well, okay. Well, you can answer that because I don't understand.
There's nothing more complicated in the Hebrew there. It's just he was the king over all Israel. Yeah.
Well, he was accepted by all as now king of Israel. They recognized him. If there was any doubt before, maybe that's what it means.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's about the best I can figure too. And like, it's almost like we're supposed to really emphasize the now when we read it, like as if it's supposed to read King Solomon was now king over all Israel. It's like as if he was sort of, only nominally king before. Now he's really the king because he's demonstrated his wisdom or something like that. Yeah, I think that's possible. It strikes me though as sort of a curious line because it really does very clearly go with what comes next. If you check out the following verses, chapter 4 begins to detail Solomon's bureaucracy for the administration of his country. And it starts with a list of his officials, Azariah and Elihoreph and Ahijah and Shisha and Jehoshaphat and Achilud. And if you're looking for any, really great baby boy, Jewish baby boy names is a great place to look, right? I hope I see a lot of baby Ahishars and Adonirams in the next generation here, but then it goes into like his organization of the provinces and all that kind of stuff. So I think this sort of that line pretty clearly goes with what's next. But it's it's interesting that whoever did the division of the Haftarah chose to put it here. And I think, like we said, my best guess is that it's sort of affirming that he deserves to be king, making a statement about his authenticity or his, kind of, real suitedness to this role. Okay. I have some more questions to ask about kind of the story as a whole. Margaret, did you want to share or say what you were going to say?
I was wondering when it said that they stood in awe of the king.
Mm-hmm.
Now, were they impressed that he could use psychology where there weren't physical evidence, or were they in terror of him because he could actually have done that if he wanted to?
That is a really good question. Let me look at the Hebrew and see if there's any help there. It says Vayir'u mipnei hamelech. So basically the same Hebrew word serves it conveys more than one sense in the English. So it's awe or fear in the sense of like, wow, but also in the sense of, wow, I'm really scared of that.
Yeah.
It's the same word in Hebrew. So it's hard to say. What do you think? What is the nature of the people's awe here? I think that is up for interpretation.
Yeah. Or some of each, but
yeah, maybe some of each. They're like,
you might
wow, this
think,
guy's really good, but also
you might think twice about bringing something to him if you thought something like that might actually happen.
Yeah.
That'd be my concern.
Sure, right?
I wouldn't
like,
bother him with little things.
He's it reminds me of like the sort of trope of like the sort of loose cannon detective on the cop TV show that's like really good at solving the case but uses some unorthodox methods to get it done, right? Maybe it's sort of like that. Like, yeah, this guy's kind of a loose cannon. Like he almost killed the kid with a sword, but also he was the only genius in the room to be able to figure this out. Like, I don't know, maybe so, yeah. That's an interesting question. What is the nature of the awe?
Do you have time for a question that's bothered me that has, no practical importance?
Yeah.
I was taught this when I was an adolescent.
Okay.
And that explains a lot. Anyway, I wondered how he planned to cut it in half. Because
yeah, I don't know. I never thought that one through.
Equally half parts, he would have to split it vertically, which would involve cleaving the skull and all down the spine, which would be difficult to do. But if you were just cutting it into two pieces, you could do it horizontally and just separate between two vertebrae. My mother was not amused.
I am certainly amused, and I get the feeling I would have really loved having you in my religious school class. I don't know. I have not thought this one through, but I suppose you're right, in terms of the lines of symmetry in the human body. Right up and down the middle is the only way to get an even split. I don't know what to tell you there. I guess so. Sure. Yeah. We'll say that. Must have been a really sharp sword.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Adam.
Well, yeah. As far as the text goes, it says his divine wisdom, which means it was scary because it was from God, and of course there was always fear of God. So divine wisdom, he had a direct line going up, and that might have had something to do with their reaction.
Yeah, maybe that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in terms of how to interpret that word yira, that awe, that it's like not only like we're a little bit scared, but we're also really amazed, and we're also like really convinced that this is, I don't know if like superhuman is the right word, but it's like almost divine in its quality somehow, that it's clear that he's this wise because of divine wisdom that he possesses. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I have some questions kind of about the whole thing, and then we'll sort of discuss how how this sits with us and how we think it speaks to us today and how it maybe spoke across generations. Thinking about the whole story, at what point do you think Solomon knew the truth? Is it only after the whole sort of play acting with the sword thing and one of the two women objects? Or do you think it might have been earlier? And I'll flip back so you can see the text in question. This is sort of my crackpot theory. I'm going to tell you. Stephanie?
I think he had sensed it beforehand.
Okay. What's your evidence? And then I'll tell you mine.
I think it was more an intuition thing from the verbiage and the physical positions of the women and how they argued their case.
Okay.
That I think he sensed who the real mother was.
Yeah, I think so too. I'll tell you why. Which is the woman who gives this speech? Which one of the two women is the first woman who says, "Here's the story. Here's the story of everything that happened"? It's the imposter, right? The other woman says, "No, the live one is my son and the dead one is yours." First insisted, "No, the dead boy is yours, the live one is mine."
Well, I've always wondered if it's not necessarily the real birth mother who's the one who's most concerned for the fate of the child.
Oh, really? You think it may? Yeah.
It's our normal assumption.
Yeah.
Oh.
But it might not be true. It might not be true.
Oh, it's the compassionate one.
It's whoever should be the mother is not the birth mother, but the one who will be the best mother for the child.
I'll buy that. I will totally buy that too, because the language in here in verse 27 is super vague. It says just give the live child to her, and it's not at all clear who he's talking about. But he does say she is its mother for whatever. But it could be like she is its mother in the sense that she's the one who's going to care for it because she's clearly the one with actual compassion for it. Whether or not there's biological connection there or not, I think that is a great read of this. That in the absence of the ability to determine maternity, what we should go with is who loves this baby more. That's very nice. My crackpot theory is that the sort of the imposter is the one who doth protest too much, right? She's the one that comes and brings this whole case, and sort of tries to set the narrative, sort of set the scene by telling this version of the events, right? But the live one is my son, the dead one is yours, the dead boy is yours, the live one is mine. I'm pretty sure that this might be where Solomon starts to get it, especially because remember how we said it was a little strange that he repeats it back? Because of what he says, one says, "This is my son, the live one, and the dead one is yours." The other says it the other way around. The dead boy is mine, the live one is yours. I think that maybe Solomon intuits here who the mother of the living child is because of the order of their words. The one who is the more compassionate says the live one and emphasizes the life first, and the other one says, the one who's less compassionate says, "No, the dead one is yours," focusing sort of on the dead child, which was actually the one that they were the mother of and actually cared more about. I'm not sure I can totally wrap this up in a package, but I think maybe Solomon already knew at this point, and that's why when he sort of repeats it all back, this is him saying, "Yeah, I know already," but he has to figure out how to demonstrate this intuition to everybody, and that's why the whole sword thing. What do you think? Tell me I'm wrong. Okay.
But couldn't you put either woman in that place? I
Yeah.
mean,
So yeah.
Child dies, might have a lot of compassion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sort of consequence of Rachel's read, is that it's possible he's giving the child to the one who is not its birth mother. but could very well be. And like, if that's the case, then this really is a commentary on, sort of the love of adopted parents for their adopted children or something like that. Yeah. I love stories like this where like, that's kind of one of both the frustrating and beautiful things about Hebrew, or in biblical Hebrew, is that the pronouns are always really, really vague. And it's hard to know 100% of the time exactly who's being spoken about. And you can kind of read it both ways, and it has interesting consequences. Okay, let's take a step back here for a second and look at the story as a story about Solomon, right? What is the author sort of trying to lead us to believe about Solomon? I think we've said some of these things already, but just let's bring these ideas back into the conversation again. What's the sort of impression we're supposed to be left with of Solomon after hearing this story? Go ahead. Maybe Rachel or Margaret, whoever's off of mute already.
We're supposed to realize that, man, this guy really he's so smart. He's capable he's just the most capable, best person to be able to do justice for the people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Like, I think this is a real pro-Solomon agenda here. Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Rachel. And also, I've learned, partly because my father-in-law was one, people in positions of leadership, and whether it's business or in government, are the best people who know and understand other people and can read them and can know their strengths and weaknesses. And that's their ability to govern or lead people. I've seen this in my own life, and I've heard this, that, judge of character and all those things. That's so much where qualities of leadership come from.
Nice. Well played. Well played. Stephanie.
Yeah, I was thinking it's more than just being smart, because there are very brilliant people that are horrendous in how they behave toward others. And so there's a sensitivity and a compassion toward people in that's involved in the judging.
Nice.
And deciding.
Yeah. And I think, based on the sort of direction we were going with that sort of possible alternative reading, that maybe there's sometimes elements of judging and justice that are more important than just sort of the letter of the law. Like the sort of easy resolution is just give the baby back to its birth mother. But maybe actual justice is giving it not to its birth mother, but to the woman who cares about it more, right? That sort of, appreciation for nuance is really valuable in a ruler or a judge, king, something like that. Leah, go ahead.
Well, I think that Solomon could be upheld. This is an example. This is a teaching moment of what you could become and what you could be.
Yeah. This is kind of a hero story, right? Yeah. So actually, this is great. That's a perfect time to make the switch into asking our sort of three reflection questions. How do you think this text might have spoken to people at the time that it was written? Remember that the audience for the Book of Kings was probably post-Babylonian destruction. This is the remnant of Judah that's left, probably a little bit in Israel, but also in Babylon. This is sort of, the whole book is kind of explaining their situation from a theological perspective. It's the result of the behavior of their past leaders. How might this story have spoken to readers of the Book of Kings? My contemporaneous readers. What do you think?
Well, it could give you a general belief that judges and kings were inspired by God and would reach a just decision. The
good ones anyway, right?
Yeah.
And this is
anybody was read about all of them would not trust some of these people with anything, but that would be the ideal.
Sure, sure. And the people who would have been reading this in the Book of Kings would have been reading about events that that transpired between 200 and 400 years previously. So maybe this is sort of a story about the good old days or something like that, when the judges were really good, and it was in that intervening time that they really got off the derech, and that's why we're now in exile in Babylon, something like that. This is what we're supposed to be getting back to, try to get people back in power that are like Solomon was. Yeah, any other thoughts? Sorry, I don't know what order to call on people in here, so just speak up.
Well, maybe I wish I knew more about this, but that it's to show, kind of picking up what others said, that there was wisdom in the past, and so this present day, it's still possible. The legacy is good. We can do it again. No matter what our problems are now, it shows, like you said, the good old days. But that means that's a positive thing, to set a positive mindset about the present.
Yeah. Okay. Emmett, Tali, Jade.
I'm wondering if it was like a polarizing kind of thing, like if some people were still very critical of those in power, and maybe critical of this verse or this section.
Yeah. Oh, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I think there would have probably been, a lot of anger at the leadership, but also probably just a lot of dismay. I think Kings, this is the agenda of the Book of Kings, is to sort of say, everything bad that happens to Israel is the fault of its leaders, which was not necessarily like the widely held, mainstream assumption. It's trying to make that argument to people. So yeah, this could have sort of, I guess, depending on where people stood already, either exacerbated that anger and that distrust in the current leadership, or sort of heightened the degree of like, how could this happen? I thought our leaders were these good judges, but hard to say, because this is not factual history. This is kind of storytelling history. How do you think this text might have spoken to communities who have read it as the Haftarah? There's been probably about 2,000 years-ish of this being read regularly with Parashat Mikeitz. If you were a Jew living in between then and now, how might you have heard this text? How might it have spoken to you?
I'm wondering if folks applied it to the situation that they lived, like the political situation they currently lived in, and was like, oh, there can be good leadership. Look at Solomon or whatever. And if that pushed people to instill more faith in like the systems in which they lived.
Maybe I could see that. Although, I think for much of Jewish history, post destruction of the Second Temple, Jews were living in other lands, right? And it wasn't our people in charge in making these decisions. I wonder if maybe there's probably a way this was read positively. Maybe it was also like, if it was a Jew in charge making the decisions, it would have been more like Solomon, right? It's not this, not this nonsense or something like that. I don't know. It crossed my mind that this text might sort of serve to reinforce those kind of stereotypes that like Jews have sort of natural intelligence, or something like that, in kind of a positive, self-affirming way, but also still stereotypical. I kind of wonder if this is sort of a story we kind of tell ourselves about ourselves.
Well, I mean, for a long time, in the exile and the diaspora, the governments that we lived under treated us very unjustly.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
So this was a story saying, when we were sovereign in our own land, we had justice, and maybe someday again. Yeah,
maybe so. Okay. So good pivot point into the last question. How does this text speak to you now? You personally, or to our present moment? What have you heard in here that speaks to now?
I think this has been one of my favorite stories.
Nice. I'm glad to hear that, Leah.
Because and the part that I relate to the most are the two women, not necessarily Solomon, who was going to cut them in half,
Sure.
but reminding me to when there is a situation where I could be selfish or I could be compassionate. You know, if I could remember this, then I might remember to be compassionate.
Nice. Yeah, I like it. So there's a personal, personal connection, and it's not even with the supposed protagonist of the story. That's great, Leah. Thanks. Yeah, other thoughts, Stephanie?
I think it tells me that I have to be very careful not to judge a situation on face value, but to really get to dig into it and see from both sides what the perspective is, and recognize if that, okay, both of the principals, people that are involved with it, or if I'm involved with someone, to remember that they aren't necessarily the other, but that they have, as you've pointed out, a divine presence in them too.
Nice. I like it. Yeah, this is I don't know. Yeah, I'm reading this as a story about emotional intelligence, right? And Solomon sort of displaying emotional intelligence, sort of reading people what they're saying without saying it. Something like that. And the importance of that to good decision making and good leadership as well. Yeah. Other thoughts? Adam? Lynn? First Adam, then Lynn?
No.
Oh, Lynn, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure exactly what the lesson is for me for right now, but there's something about the public nature of this case brought before King Solomon and having to evaluate with everyone watching and waiting to see, well, how are you going to resolve this one? There's something about the public versus private nature of our actions and of our convictions and what we do with that. And it can be different when it's in the privacy of your own thoughts in your own home or when you're in the public sphere.
Hey, nice. That's great. Yeah, sort of, we don't really hear about the setting that this unfolds in. I imagine it unfolding in his throne room or whatever, but yeah, that adds a new dimension of sort of justice dispensed publicly, right? And the way that sort of changes the stakes of the game. And maybe also reveals really Solomon's character even more so than if this had been, sort of, a private discussion in his office or something like that. I always imagined a crowd of people around, but I don't totally know why. Yeah. Sorry, Adam, did you actually have something to say? I might have talked over you there.
No, not at all. Lynn's point was better than mine. I was just going to say it shows for a present day reader, and it's me this way to some. I mean, this is what good, wise leadership can look like. I mean, this is a template. And I know that some of the greatest, say, Supreme Court justices like Cardozo and Frankfurter were steeped in biblical stories like this and had that training and had wisdom when they sat on the bench.
Nice.
To be wise judges, as well as, you could scale that up to any leader, and also our present thing happening, what's happening right now in the news, and hopefully it will be wisely, and Lynn may have been hinting at this.
Agreed.
Decided.
Yeah, I tell you, all the stories about good and bad government really hit home for me these days. Absolutely. No doubt about it. I'd say the only other thing I would add, and you all have really wonderful readings of this. They really expanded my on my horizons on this. What's otherwise kind of a short, seemingly straightforward text. So thank you for that. my only other thought is that this is actually kind of an appropriate Hanukkah message as well, even though it is read technically right after the end of Hanukkah, at least on the Shabbat it is. We're reading it still already during Hanukkah, which is that, you know, the true strength and true justice doesn't come through the sword, but it comes from within, from within hearts and minds, and through the application of wisdom and mercy and ideals like those. It's expressed in our willingness to and our ability to do justice and mercy in the world, right? That's where our strength, specifically as Jewish people, and looking at this as a Jewish story. This is a story not about winning victory, you know, even though it does involve a sword. It's deliberately never used, right? This is a story about winning battles with our minds, right? The sort of not by might, not by power idea that goes along with Hanukkah. Yeah, so I think this is a really worthwhile text to read at this time of the year as well.